If you were listening to pop around the year 2000, you couldn't escape the Cheiron sound. The Swedish production house had become one of the defining forces of the era, creating huge hits for Britney, Backstreet Boys and NSYNC. At the centre of it all was Max Martin, who had become the most recognisable name behind the new wave of pop. At the same time, R&B was quickly becoming the modern marker for what cool sounded like. Its producers were creating some of the most forward-thinking music on the radio, and pop stars were starting to take note. One of the producers at the forefront was Rodney Jerkins, better known as Darkchild, who by this point had already produced some of the biggest R&B records of the late 90s. But he wasn't alone. If you look at the producers who truly carried the sound of the late 90s R&B into mainstream pop, three names stand out: Darkchild, Timbaland and the Neptunes. Of course, they weren't the only R&B producers working with pop stars during this period. Producers like Scott Storch and Jam & Lewis, and many others, would also create major crossover records through the late 90s and 2000s, and their influence will come up later. But Darkchild, Timbaland and the Neptunes became the producers who would come to define pop music in the years that followed. So, what made each of them so sought after in the first place? Before pop stars came calling, let's go back to the R&B records that put Darkchild, Timbaland and the Neptunes on the map. First up, Darkchild. After producing early records like Joe's Don't Want to Be a Player, his first real break came on Mary J. Blige's Share My World album when he was just 19. But it was the following year, 1998, when everything would explode. On Brandy's Never Say Never, he produced almost every track, including The Boy Is Mine and fan favourite Angel in Disguise. From there, things moved fast. 4 tracks on Whitney Houston's My Love Is Your Love, including It's Not Right But It's Okay, Jennifer Lopez's debut single If You Had My Love, and of course Say My Name by Destiny's Child, which earned him his first Enough by Tony Braxton, was right around the corner too. Built around syncopated rhythms, stuttering drum patterns, arpeggiated harp melodies, and sweeping strings, Darkchild's production captured the sleek, futuristic feel of the Y2K era. That sound reached its peak on projects like Michael Jackson's Invincible and Brandy's Full Moon, where his vision of futuristic R&B was fully realised. Unlike Timbaland and the Neptunes, Darkchild never really expanded into the hip-hop world. His focus remained firmly on R&B and vocal-driven records, shaped by his background as a classically trained pianist with deep gospel roots. Next, Timbaland. His first major successes came through Genuine's debut album, Genuine the Bachelor, which he produced almost entirely, including Pony, as well as R. Lear's album, 1 in a Million. Around the same time, he became synonymous with Missy Elliott, producing heavily across her first 5 albums and helping create hits like Get Your Freak On, Work It and Pass That Dutch. Outside of those 3, Timbaland spent much of the late 90s building his reputation through remixes and selective productions for artists like SWV, Destiny's Child, Janet Jackson and Usher. But it was records like Jay-Z's Big Pimpin' that began pushing him into the spotlight. At this point, Timbaland's sound was built around off-kilter drum programming with offbeat snares, hi-hat rolls, and eccentric samples. Think chirping crickets and his own vocal sound effects that turned his music into full-on creative experiments. Sometimes spacey, often beat-driven, and always innovative. Add in his experimental unconventional chord progressions and Indian-inspired melodies, and his production sounded like nothing else. It was in 2002, though, when his profile would reach another level as he teamed up with a former boy band star embarking on a solo career, beginning one of the most important producer-artist partnerships of the decade. That same artist would also go on to work extensively with the Neptunes. Where Darkchild and Timbaland were already established by the turn of the millennium, the Neptunes, made up of Chad Hugo and of course Pharrell, really exploded from 2000 onwards, helped in part by Jay-Z's I Just Wanna Love You, Give It To Me, which perfectly captured their signature style. Sparse, minimalist production, jagged bass lines, quirky synths, and Pharrell's unmistakable hooks.
Give it to me. Give me that funk, that sweet, that nasty, that gushy stuff.
But they could also shift effortlessly into something much softer, using dreamy chords and spacious arrangements that gave many of their records an almost weightless feel. Before Jay-Z, they had produced Khalees's acclaimed debut Kaleidoscope, which included Caught Out There and the standout Get Along With You. Their partnership with her would continue over the next few years, culminating in one of their biggest songs, Milkshake. In 2001, they launched NERD alongside Shay Haley, blending hip-hop, rock and funk into a sound that embodied the rap rock skater culture of the early 2000s. It was later, that same year, that they would begin working with the biggest female pop star of the era, marking their arrival on pop's biggest stage. By this point, seeing Darkchild, Timbaland or the Neptunes in the credits held weight. Even before hearing the song, you just knew that you were about to hear something fresh and expensive sounding. Their producer tags became part of the experience too, a signature that instantly told you who was behind the record. Of course, the soundscape wasn't just about three names. They were part of a much bigger wave of producers shaping R&B at the time. Jam and Lewis had already become R&B legends through their work with Janet Jackson. Babyface had helped define 90s R&B balladry with Boyz II Men and Toni Braxton. Jermaine Dupri was blending R&B and Atlanta hip-hop influences with Mariah Carey and Usher, while Dallas Austin brought his guitar-driven urban sound to records from Michael Jackson, TLC and Monica. Then there were the producers, who were everywhere during this peak, even if their names weren't always as widely recognised. No Scrubs and Bills hitmaker Shakespeare, Danish duo Soul Shock and Carlin, and neo-soul masters Dre and Adele, but to name a few. Together, they all helped shape the evolution of contemporary R&B, from the new jack swing of the early 90s, through the hip-hop influenced sounds of the mid-90s, to the digital productions of the late 90s and early 2000s that would become the benchmark of what felt modern. And as that sound took over courtesy of R&B titans of the time, Destiny's Child, Brandy, Usher and TLC, the biggest pop stars in the world started looking to these producers for their own evolution. Now that concept wasn't entirely new. Madonna had already turned to Babyface and Alice Austin on Bedtime Stories back in 1994, showing that R&B producers could be a powerful tool for artistic reinvention. But by the early 2000s, that approach was becoming industry standard. So staying in 2000, we start to see pop stars beginning to lean more heavily into R&B influences. For some of them, it was the music they had grown up with. Britney, in particular, had always spoken about her love of R&B, citing artists like Brandy, Jill Scott, India.Arie and Janet as influences. When she released her second album, Oops, I Did It Again, in May 2000, it became another record-breaking success, built largely around the Max Martin pop formula that had made her a superstar. But hidden among the polished teen pop hits were signs of a different direction. Tracks like Don't Go Knocking on My Door brought a stronger R&B energy into her sound, while her Darkchild-produced cover of I Can't Get No Satisfaction hinted at the direction she would fully embrace on her next album. And Britney wasn't alone. If you go back through the credits of Backstreet Boys, Black and Blue, and NSYNC Celebrity, you'll notice each album featured exactly one Darkchild production. As well as Britney's Satisfaction, Backstreet Boys had Shining Star, and NSYNC had the title track Celebrity. The placement of these songs is also telling. Each one appeared relatively early in the tracklist, but what's even more interesting is that these songs were slightly different from the usual Darkchild formula. Rodney Jerkins received the production credit, But unlike many of his R&B records, there was no additional songwriting credits from his usual collaborators, Sean Daniels and Fred Jerkins. According to Steve Lunt, Britney's then A&R, Darkchild was keen to get a placement on the Oops album, so perhaps he was willing to deviate from his normal way of working to make it happen.
I know that Rodney kept on, handing songs in for Britney to do, and they were never really sort of suitable for Britney. They came from too much of an R&B background and didn't really get the lyrical thing that Britney was after either. So we never actually sort of did any of his songs. He really wants to get on this record. Let me think of something, And then he put that to Britney, I guess, and they decided to go ahead with it.
It almost feels like these albums were experimenting with the Darkchild sound, bringing in his production style without fully importing the entire R&B songwriting team behind it. Perhaps an initial concern from Jive Records, label for Britney, Backstreet Boys and NSYNC at the time, about alienating their younger pop audience. And this wasn't limited to Darkchild. Even Shakespeare's It Makes Me Ill for NSYNC felt much more pop-adjacent than his more R&B production on TLC's No Scrubs and Destiny's Child's The Writings on the Wall. The biggest shift would happen between 2000 and 2001. The difference between NSYNC's No Strings Attached and Celebrity albums shows how quickly pop was beginning to absorb R&B influences. While No Strings Attached was still built around the polished Max Martin pop formula, Celebrity introduced a much stronger urban edge, including Rodney Jerkins' title track and the Neptunes produced Girlfriend, which would later be remixed as a single featuring Nelly. Britney followed a similar path. The move from Oops, I Did It Again to self-titled Britney saw her move away from the pure teen pop formula and embrace a darker, more R&B driven sound, resulting in career-defining I'm a Slave for You, produced by the Neptunes. With its stripped-back rhythm, sparse percussion and unmistakable groove, it was originally intended for Janet, but became the song that signalled Britney's coming of age. Her second Neptunes track, Boys, would follow a similar direction. Darkchild also contributed 3 tracks to the album, although 2 were co-productions with pop producers Brian and Josh, perhaps again suggesting a more cautious approach to bringing that sound into Britney's world. Even so, Let Me Be fully embraces the syncopated Darkchild production style. As the album campaign progressed, Britney leaned even further into R&B, releasing the Pharrell-assisted remix of Boys and the Darkchild remix of the originally Max Martin-produced Overprotected as singles. What's interesting about Britney's catalogue is that the albums where she had the most creative input, Britney, In the Zone, Blackout and Glory, are also her most R&B influenced. Why Should I Be Sad from Blackout, another Neptunes production featuring Pharrell, is a perfect example of that direction. Britney's success created a new blueprint that many labels tried to replicate. During that decade, there was a wave of young white female pop singers being positioned between pop and R&B, with producers like Timbaland and Darkchild developing their own artists. Timbaland worked with Kylie Dean through his Mosley music group Camp, while Darkchild was heavily involved in Ashley Ballard's debut project. But the formula would prove much harder to recreate than it looked. The combination of pop accessibility and R&B credibility was growing, but very few artists managed to capture the cultural impact of Britney. From Britney, we move to Justin. If Britney used R&B producers to mature her sound, Justin used them to reinvent himself completely. The polished teen pop sound of NSYNC was replaced with funk grooves, live instrumentation, hip-hop rhythms, and contemporary R&B production. It was a bold move for someone whose career had been built on Max Martin's immaculate pop, although Gone and Girlfriend from Celebrity had already hinted at the direction he wanted to take. It would be the Neptunes and Timbaland who would produce the bulk of Justified, with additional songs from The Underdogs and Bryant McKnight. Listening back today, it's impossible to confuse the Neptunes tracks with the Timbaland tracks. The Neptunes songs feel crisp, live-sounding and groove-driven, reminiscent of NERD's more laid-back tracks than their tracks with Jay-Z or Britney, while Timbaland's are more experimental, with harder urban-style beats. You can hear the difference clearly on tracks like Take It From Here versus tracks like Oh Know What You Got. Together, they brought two contrasting production styles to the album that somehow still felt cohesive. Interestingly, just as the Neptunes tracks with Britney had originally been made for Janet Jackson, many of their tracks on Justified had been made for Michael Jackson's Invincible. Michael would instead use Darkchild for a more produced sound. Timbaland would continue to play a major role in Justin's career, becoming the defining producer behind his next era. With the introduction of a then unknown Danger, over time, the pair would push Justin's sound beyond the R&B foundations of Justified into something much more expansive, a shift we'll return to later. After Britney and Justin, the other big pop star of the early 2000s was Christina Aguilera. Unlike Britney and Justin, Christina had already experimented with R&B sounds as far back as 1999 on her debut. So her evolution took a slightly different path. She wasn't necessarily chasing the futuristic Y2K R&B sound that defined this era. Instead, she was using those influences alongside rock, pop, and traditional soul to build a more eclectic identity. And Stripped was the perfect example of that. The album moved between soulful pop and pop balladry, with some of its most contemporary R&B moments coming through collaborations with rappers. Lead single, the Rock Wilder produced Dirty, featuring Redman, leaned heavily into the hip-hop R&B crossover, borrowing from Redman's own Let's Get Dirty, I Can Get in the Club. Can't Hold Us Down with Lil' Kim continued that direction, while songs like Lovin' Me For Me and the Alicia Keys produced Impossible showed a more traditional R&B influence. A then relatively unknown Scott Storch also played a role on the album, although interestingly, his most successful single, Fighter, moved away from R&B altogether for an arena rock sound. If you were ranking Britney, Justin and Christina by how much they embraced that late 90s, early 2000s R&B production wave, Christina would come last. Her influences were rooted more in classic soul than the modern R&B that was shaping pop at the time. That would become even clearer on her next album, Back to Basics, where she moved further into old school jazz, soul and funk influences, with production from DJ Premier, though tracks like On Our Way were very much in the R&B realm. Throughout her later albums, Christina would remain centered around soulful pop, occasionally exploring a purer R&B sound with tracks like Sex for Breakfast, Like I Do and Pipe. It wasn't just Britney, Justin and Christina though. By the early 2000s, almost every major pop act was looking towards the R&B hitmakers of the time to give them a credibility edge which their pop work didn't have. After the massive success of their first two albums, the Spice Girls' third album, Forever, from 2000, marked a clear attempt to move away from the pop sound they'd created with English producers Biffco and Absolute. Their A&R team reportedly felt that another pop album would struggle, particularly in America, and the group themselves were interested in exploring a more mature R&B direction, having already dabbled in the genre on songs like Say You'll Be There and Denying. And who did they turn to? Darkchild and Jam & Lewis. Darkchild and his team produced lead single Holla and 6 other tracks. Jam & Lewis added a further 2. All original pop tracks initially recorded with our old producers were scrapped, with the exception of Right Back At Ya, which was reproduced by Uncle Freddie. Even outside the group, the members continued exploring this R&B direction. Victoria Beckham's self-titled solo album brought in the Underdogs and Soul Shock and Carlin. While Mel B's album Hot featured an unusually high-profile lineup of R&B producers, including Timbaland, Darkchild, Jam & Lewis, Teddy Riley, Missy Elliott and Cisco. Coming from one of the biggest pop groups in history, it showed how strongly the industry was moving into R&B at the time. Mel C also experimented in the genre with Never Be the Same Again, an R&B tinged single featuring Left Eye from TLC. Once pop's heavyweights started working with R&B's hitmakers, everyone else wanted in. After Jessica Simpson's debut album failed to match the impact of Britney and Christina's first records, her follow-up Irresistible moved much closer towards teen pop and R&B, including 2 productions from Darkchild She would continue exploring that sound on her Public Affair album with Jam & Lewis and the Scotch Storch produced Fired Up. As he became one of the most in-demand producers of the early to mid-2000s, working with everyone from Ricky Martin to Paris Hilton and even Brooke Hogan. Pink took a slightly different path. Her debut album, Can't Take Me Home, was heavily rooted in urban sounds already, with production from names like Babyface, Shakespeare and Soul Shock and Carlin.
Trying to blend, trying to vibe, trying to live just one life.
But rather than continuing down that route, she moved towards the pop rock sound that would define much of her career, similar to artists like Kelly Clarkson. Even so, she would still occasionally dabble, including on the Scott Storch-produced Family Portrait. Perhaps one of the biggest pivots, though, was No Doubt. A band that was known for ska, punk and alternative rock suddenly found themselves working with the Neptunes on Hella Good, bringing their futuristic production style into a completely different world. Gwen Stefani would take that crossover even further in her solo career, working with the Neptunes alongside producers like Dr. Dre, Swiss Beats, Andre 3000 and Jam & Lewis. And actually, it was Jam & Lewis who had already brought R&B sounds to a former boy band member, producing Jordan Knight's solo album 1999, 3 years before Justin would make his same transition with Timbaland and the Neptunes on Justified. By this point, having R&B songs and working with R&B producers had become a signifier of maturity and credibility. It gave established pop stars a way to move beyond their original image without completely abandoning mainstream appeal. Many were also embracing hip-hop, with rapper features becoming another way to add edge to their music. Justin teamed up with Clips on his debut single, Like I Love You, a year before he and his former bandmates added Nelly to the remix of Girlfriend. Gwen Stefani paired with Eve on Rich Girl, even Paris Hilton had Fat Joe and Jadakiss on her record, and there were countless others. The formula was simple: pop star plus R&B producer plus rapper equals hit. But we need to make a crucial distinction here. When we say R&B took over mainstream music, there were actually 2 different things happening at the same time. On one side, you had pop stars like Britney, Justin and Christina using R&B producers, sounds and songwriting approaches to move beyond the teen pop world they had come from. But on the other side, R&B artists themselves were becoming some of the biggest pop stars on earth. Beyonce, Usher, Alicia Keys and Brandy weren't chasing pop trends or borrowing from another genre. Their R&B was the trend. Mainstream culture had simply caught up to them. Think of it like this. Artists like Destiny's Child and TLC were bringing R&B into the pop world, while Britney and Justin were bringing pop audiences towards R&B. And while both of those forces dominated the charts, a third lane was quietly flourishing in the background. Neo-soul artists like Jill Scott, D'Angelo, Music Soulchild and Flowetry were taking R&B in a different direction, one built around warm, organic production, live instrumentation, jazz-influenced chords, and more introspective songwriting.
Don't you forget it, don't you forget your way.
While commercial R&B was becoming increasingly digital and influenced by hip-hop, neo-soul offered a different vision of what the genre could be during this period. So, by the early 2000s, there wasn't one version of R&B. There was pop music embracing R&B producers, R&B artists becoming global pop forces, and neo-soul artists preserving a more traditional side for its purists. But across all of these movements, one thing was clear. R&B had become the defining sound of the era. Here's the thing about this period of music. The definition of modern kept changing. The sounds that felt futuristic could feel dated just months later. For producers like Timbaland, the Neptunes and Darkchild, continued success would depend on more than just having a signature sound. They had to keep evolving because music was constantly moving towards something new. No producer represents evolution better than Timbaland. Well, Max Martin too, but we'll get to him later. In the mid to late 90s, Timbaland helped create a completely new landscape for R&B. As we've already seen, his work with artists like Aaliyah and Genuine sounded unlike anything else on the radio. And his signature Indian-influenced melodies set a trend others like Scott Storch would follow. By 2002, however, his sound would evolve. The producer who had created some of the coldest, most futuristic R&B of the late 90s suddenly sounded warmer and more human. He started incorporating more beatboxing, vocal percussion, fuller arrangements, and subtle world music influences into his work.
One last chance to advance beyond the second round of the big dance. All my plans. I know you like my shoes, cause you walk in my shoes, and would you be prepared to see?
Even country and Coldplay samples could be heard. Through 2006 to 2008, Timbaland's sound would develop again. The sounds of Justified, Aphrodisiac and Deliverance would eventually give way to the more electronic, synth-heavy sound of Future Sex Love Sounds, Nelly Furtado's Loose, and Madonna's Hard Candy.
I can see us on the countryside, sitting on the grassland side by side.
This specific evolution of his sound was in part spurred on by his partnership with protege Danger, who himself was introducing both innovative R&B pop sounds to new pop stars and more electronic R&B infused pop sounds on albums like Blackout and Welcome to the Dollhouse.
If you can't take it back, get back, get back, get back, get back, get back. If you can't take it back, if you want my love, come get me.
At this point, Timbaland and Danger were no longer simply making R&B records, or even R&B influenced pop records. They were helping create an entirely new version of music. And that freedom allowed them to work with artists far beyond the worlds they originally came from. Both contributed to Bjork's Volta and Duran Duran's Red Carpet Massacre albums. While Timbaland also produced Chris Cornell's Scream album and tracks on Ashlee Simpson's Bittersweet album. whilst Danger brought his sound to Simple Plan's self-titled album. Their production styles had become the attraction. They could bring their R&B instincts into completely different genres, while still maintaining the approach that made their sound unique. Timbaland even started doing it on his own records.
Watching her shoulders like a memory from the past. I tell her
By the mid-2000s, Rodney Jerkins had also taken the Darkchild sound through several distinct evolutions. His futuristic production style had been one of the most defining sounds of the turn of the millennium, and over the years that followed, he continued to evolve that sound, incorporating new influences while maintaining the signature elements that made his production recognisable. You can hear these phases across his catalogue. From the sleek late 90s R&B he created for Brandy, Toni Braxton, Destiny's Child and Whitney Houston, to the futuristic, digital-leaning sound of Michael Jackson's Invincible, Brandy's Full Moon and TLC's 3D. From there, his production moved into heavier, more percussive and beat-driven records like Destiny's Child's Lose My Breath and Amarion's Drop That Heater. Before arriving at the ultra-crisp, polished R&B sound that defined much of his mid-2000s work for the likes of Mary J. Blige and Mariah. One example of this shift came in 2004, when Rodney's production on Ray J's Keep Sweatin' leaned into the sharp synths and high-energy aesthetic of the crunk sound, reflecting the wider changes happening across R&B. He also occasionally took surprising detours into other genres. He explored rock on Britney's Don't Keep Me Waiting, Kelly Clarkson's I Forgive You, and Jesse James's I Look So Good Without You. They weren't the kind of records most people would associate with him, but they showed he wasn't afraid to step outside the sound that had made his name. The Neptunes approached this changing landscape from a different position. By the mid-2000s, their signature sound had become one of the most recognisable in music, but beneath that familiar formula was a history of experimentation. Pharrell and Chad had always explored different musical worlds, creating records across hip-hop, R&B, pop, rock and alternative music, and they wouldn't be afraid to push artists into different directions. Perhaps the best example of this is Khalees's Wonderland. Released in 2001, the album was anything but a straightforward R&B project. Instead, the Neptunes blended rock, funk, electronic music and alternative pop into something that still feels difficult to categorise today. Songs like Perfect Day, co-written with No Doubt, sounded completely removed from contemporary R&B, yet still carried the unmistakable DNA of the Neptunes. It showed that their creativity was never just about creating a recognisable drum pattern or a 4-count. It was about challenging what artists could sound like. Perhaps nobody understood the importance of evolution better than Max Martin. Just as Timbaland transformed his sound across the decade, Max Martin did the same. He began with the polished teen pop that defined artists like Britney, NSYNC and Backstreet Boys.
It's gotta be
But by the mid-2000s, the mainstream landscape was shifting. While R&B continued to dominate pop radio, rock was also enjoying a major commercial moment, with bands like Linkin Park, Limp Bizkit, Evanescence and Puddle of Mud becoming some of the biggest acts in the world. Those influences soon filtered into pop, with artists like Avril Lavigne, Pink and Kelly Clarkson bringing a more guitar-driven edge to the pop charts. Max Martin adapted alongside them, embracing pop-rock productions while still maintaining the melodic instincts that made him successful. Then, as EDM took over towards the end of the decade, he reinvented himself again, with the dance pop of Britney's Femme Fatale, a string of hits for Katy Perry, and eventually became one of the key architects behind Taylor Swift's sound. There's an interesting irony about the latter part of the 2000s. R&B had become so influential that much of what counted as pop was now built on R&B foundations. But as we've seen, the sound itself was changing. The sounds pioneered by Darkchild, Timbaland and the Neptunes were being replaced by something more formulaic. Production duo Stargate were amongst the spearheads, crafting simpler, highly melodic productions that translated R&B into something built for the masses. Alongside the lush ballad style of Bryan-Michael Cox, this became the dominant blueprint for the mid to late 2000s crossover.
You must not know about me. You must not know about me.
Too strong for too long.
And I can't be without you, baby.
And in the process, the genre lost some of its edge. The wild creativity of the previous generation of producers was replaced by a style that was much easier for the rest of the industry to replicate. Technology also played a big part in changing the once ubiquity of the R&B super producers. As music production software became more accessible, it meant more people could create polished, professional-sounding records without relying on a handful of elite and expensive producers. And so the idea of one producer defining an entire era became much harder to sustain. However, the influence of that generation never disappeared. The next wave of R&B hitmakers continued carrying elements of that sound into the next decade. But music trends continue to evolve. The electronic and dance influences that had been building underground became increasingly dominant. And pop entered the era of EDM. R&B itself also changed. Instead of the huge crossover productions that defined the early 2000s, the genre moved towards more atmospheric, mood-driven sounds. Shorter too, so catered to streaming and social media. The super producers of the late 90s and early 2000s may no longer dominate popular music in the same way, but their influence remains everywhere. Timbaland's experimentation, the Neptunes' futurism, and Darkchild's innovation all became part of the foundation of the music of today.